Perfect.
Good morning, everyone. First, I want to thank Carla and Brittany and Josh and fellow members of the Planning Committee. It's been a fun process to think about these issues and put this panel together, and it's always fun for me to be able to talk about adolescent development. I had the privilege of being part of the National Academies Consensus Committee that released the Promise of Adolescence report that Josh referenced at the beginning. And I'm mentioning that because you'll see a couple of some of the messages that I'll talk about come directly from that report, and I encourage all of you to take a look at it. So here's just an overview. I'm going to try and give this 360 view of early adolescent development in about 18 minutes or so, so hang on, I'll be going pretty quickly. But I love that Phyllis went first, and I think that some of what I'll talk about at a broad level is really brought to life by the stories that she shared about what this looks like on the ground from day to day. So when we're thinking about adolescence, I snagged this image from the National Academies report. We defined adolescence as a period of developmental change in a person's life that bridges childhood and adulthood. And after several discussions about, the beginning and end point, just generally agreed that it begins with the onset of puberty around age 10 or so and ends during the mid-20s. Most of my remarks for today will focus on what you see here, sort of the two early periods of shading, early adolescence through kind of about 14 years or so. And the Association for Middle Level Education defines young adolescents as including youth ages 10 to 15. So within that age bracket, there are about 21 million early adolescents. So this is 10 to 14-year-olds in the United States, and we're thinking about their representation in the population. Okay, so I'm going to just go through some core developmental processes that I think are important, and Phyllis mentioned some of these, although I'll go into a little bit more detail. So we'll start with puberty, because again, we talk about that as being specific sets of pubertal changes marking the onset of adolescence. We know that puberty catalyzes a cascade of important changes in adolescence, including development of brain areas that are sensitive to social information, especially from peers. Puberty also catalyzes emerging interests in intimate relationships, growing awareness of one's sexuality. And while there are general biological processes that are universal, we of course know there is a ton of individual variation, which is why you can have a middle school student who looks like they're in third grade and one who's also shaving. So there's variation in terms of things like timing of particular processes, where young people are in relation to their peers, and how quickly they go through the process of puberty. And this is due to interacting biological and environmental factors. So it's something that I think is important to consider, particularly as youth are moving into kind of middle school settings. Here is a core message from the National Academies report, and that is that adolescent brains are uniquely fit to prepare young people to meet new life challenges. Neural connections within and between brain regions begin to increase in strength and efficiency, and the timing and location of these changes matters and is unique to adolescence. So puberty is actually believed to be a catalyst for particular kinds of changes. The ones that happen earliest are in what are called the limbic regions of the brain. So I often move my hand when I'm talking about this. We can think of the limbic regions as being the innermost regions. So for me, I think about if my thumb is underneath my fingers, the thumb is sort of these inner limbic regions of the brain. And that's important because in early adolescence, neural connections in these regions are relatively strong. So without going into the technical detail, you can see that early adolescence is the second of these four graphics. And where the lines are sort of darkest and boldest represent strengthening connections in the areas, the limbic regions of the brain, that are associated with things like sensitivity to rewards, to social information, to threats, to novelty, and to peers. But it takes more time for connections in the cortical or outer areas of the brain to develop, so that would be kind of this part of my hand. And you can see here that these are the ones on the top. So the lines are not as bold, and there's also some dotted lines showing that connections between regions and kind of top to bottom are also strengthening. So the cortical regions are responsible for things like planning and decision-making, cognitive control, and self-efficacy. So the pattern of change makes early adolescence unique. And as I said before, these changes are associated with increases in sensitivity to rewards, a willingness to take risks, and the salience of social relationships and social status. So on the one hand, sometimes these kinds of changes, I think, lead to the sorts of behaviors that we may find vexing in early adolescence, but we also may think of them as being necessary for exploring new environments, for building non-familial relationships, and growing the cognitive and social and emotional skills that are eventually needed as young people transition through adolescence and into adulthood. So these very same expanding cognitive and social emotional skills facilitate exploration of important questions around identity, which Phyllis has already addressed. So I won't talk too much more about it now. We know from some of the work on identity development in early adolescence that young people often desire to identify themselves in multiple ways beyond assigned roles. So that may be an assigned role in the family, or in a school setting. And sometimes what can cause distress for some young people is when there are contradictions between their ideal visions of themselves versus how they're actually experiencing reality. I don't know if anybody's seen the movie 8th Grade, which is about, yes, I see you nodding. If you've seen it, you know that that Kayla, who's the kind of main character, is struggling. She's got this really bubbly online persona. It's very social. She's giving her peers advice, but day to day, she's highly anxious and introverted and kind of struggles even with just talking to her peers through school. So it's a nice example of sometimes when there's a little bit of a disconnect between your ideal self and your actual self. So in sum, we know there's a lot going on physically and neurobiologically and psychosocially in early adolescence. It's a time when young people are changing, and they're often, as Phyllis mentioned, transitioning into secondary school settings that are much different from what they experienced in elementary school. So think about, your own experience. If your body is changing and then you're also making these other kinds of transitions, we need to think carefully about environments. So I want to move on to talk briefly about factors that compromise development. So we often call these risk factors. And the first one that I want to mention that I don't think often gets enough attention is sleep. So it's fairly straightforward, but it's also pretty important because there's room for improvement, which I'll come back to a little bit later. We know that young adolescents need between 8.5 and 9.5 hours of sleep, but we also know that during this time, because of biological changes, psychosocial changes, and environmental changes, there's this kind of perfect storm that leads to less opportunities for sleep. So as a result of some of the pubertal changes, adolescents' internal clocks start to shift towards a delay in sleep onset. So they actually don't feel as tired early in the night as they might have as a child, and it may take longer for them to fall asleep. There's also sort of this slow to rise phenomenon. So any of you who've got an adolescent know it may be hard to wake them up early in the morning, and part of that comes from some of these biological changes in kind of circadian rhythms. Young adolescents may have more autonomy over their bedtime, more schoolwork to complete in the evenings, and then feel sort of socially like they want to remain connected with their friends into the wee hours of the evening and early morning. So they may be on screens and other connections. So sleep deficits, fortunately, are not as pronounced in early adolescence as they are as young people move throughout adolescence, but we know that a lack of good sleep has long and short-term consequences for behavioral, psychological, and academic functioning. So I'll return to sleep later as an opportunity for kind of making some change. Okay, briefly, I want to talk about some recent data on tobacco and e-cigarette use. So the use of tobacco products has remained steady among youth, but e-cigarette use and vaping have been increasing in recent years. In the graph, which may be a little difficult to see, but middle schoolers are depicted in the blue lines. E-cigarette use increased from about 0.5% in 2011 to almost 5% in 2018. And a recent report that I actually just read this morning from the Journal of the American Medical Association, found the prevalence of self-reported e-cigarette use in 2019 was 10.5% among middle school students. And they had a sample of middle schoolers and high schoolers of about 11,000 young people. So it's something that's on the rise. We know, of course, that tobacco products cause harm, and they may be especially problematic for young adolescents, as exposure to toxins can, what we call in the report, sort of get under the skin during this malleable period of development. So it's an important trend worth keeping our eye on. Another trend that Phyllis mentioned already are the changing rates of suicide among young people. So on the positive side, suicide rates are relatively low among young adolescents, so they're down at the bottom, 10 to 14-year-olds. And you can see that across all, there's a higher prevalence among males versus females. But the graph there shows the trend among 12 to 19-year-olds that's been on the rise over time. So something else to keep our eye on, in particular because we know that some of those pubertal changes and the corresponding changes in neurobiology make early adolescence a period of vulnerability for mental health. And you heard that in some of the stories that Phyllis mentioned. And last, I want to mention issues of equity in education. So early adolescence marks the beginning of what some people call the age of opportunity. But we know that the reality is that opportunities to access supportive and enriching educational environments are not equally available to all youth. Bias, discrimination, and oppression are the root causes of many inequities. And while all youth and all of us are impacted by these, youth from historically marginalized groups often face disproportionately negative impacts. So in middle schools, students' educational trajectories may start to become more path dependent with things like tracking. So they may get set on these fixed pathways that are hard to get off of. And of course, we know there are racial disparities in access to and enrollment in high-level math and science classes, in gifted programs, and well-documented racial disparities in discipline. From a psychosocial perspective, the same cognitive and social capacities that help youth recognize bias as they're sort of developing their identities also make them more aware of stereotypes. And we know from research that student awareness of bias in treatment by school staff can undermine trust and a sense of belonging and performance in middle school. So there's some great work that studies middle school students in particular. Okay, moving right along. This is another important message from the National Academies report. And I want to kind of frame it in a couple of ways. So it's a positive message. Throughout the report, we try to talk about this period as a period of opportunity. We know that malleable adolescent brains create more sort of opportunity for youth to be adaptive to innovation, but they also create vulnerability for toxic experiences. So I mentioned already things like tobacco exposure, antisocial relationships, exposure to violence. Experiences, both good and bad, can get under the skin. And inequality fundamentally challenges opportunities of adolescence. On the positive side, we know that developing adolescents are responsive to change in underlying conditions, and that adolescents have great capacity for resilience. So in my last few slides, that's what I want to focus on. So briefly, I'll talk about factors that promote positive development. The three that I'll talk about briefly are parents and families, which again, you heard about a little bit from Phyllis. Thinking about developmentally responsive practices in schools, which we also have some insight into. And then I said I would revisit sleep in the end. One of the interventions that we highlight in the National Academies report that I thought would be relevant to talk about is called the Strong African American Families Program. And the original intervention served African American parents and young adolescents who were living in low-income rural communities. And the program focused on culturally meaningful messages around parenting, around positive identity, and self-esteem. When the intervention was originally done, researchers found short-term positive effects on things like youth, sort of psychosocial outcomes. So positive racial identity, the ability to deal with discrimination, positive self-esteem. But they've also continued following the young people who were part of the study. So it was a randomized evaluation. There were youth who participated in the intervention, and there was a control group of young people as well. And they found that those who participated 10 years later had reduced insulin levels, and this was among a population that was at high risk for type 2 diabetes. There's also been recent studies that have where they've taken sort of MRI data from young people who were in the intervention and found positive effects in terms of like healthy brain development over time. So the young people are now in their 20s, and they're still finding that an intervention that was done when they were 12 and 13 is having lasting effects. So I think one message we can take home from this is that focusing on families and parent-youth relationships, as well as cultural identity, can be beneficial in the long term. And I think even more importantly, this intervention demonstrates that all is not lost if we don't catch young people in early childhood. I think often we have this idea that 0 to 3 or 0 to 5 are the most important years of development, but we know from something like this that if we intervene in early adolescence, we can change trajectories for the better. And in fact, I think we need more work on this, but early adolescence may be an ideal time for this sort of intervention, and one that's sort of framed from a developmental perspective. It capitalized on things like relationships and identity. So I think that's an important take-home message in addition to the importance of family relationships. Okay, there's a whole lot of work on developmentally responsive practices in schools, and I don't have time to talk about too much, but I just want to highlight there's some research that tries to pull together what seems to be the key ingredients for interventions, school-based interventions that are most effective during this period of development. And it seems that sort of focusing on and taking into consideration early adolescents' heightened sensitivity to social information and social status is really critical for designing effective interventions. So what that doesn't look like is kind of adults lecturing at kids. What it does look like is thinking about ways to build relationships. For example, you heard from Phyllis about the boy who was calling out these random words. And in her conversation with him, there was sort of a focus on empathy and trying to understand why he was doing what he was doing, as opposed to making assumptions about his intentions. And so there's some great research looking at interventions to train teachers to use more of an empathic approach to discipline that's really about building and maintaining relationships with young people that is shown to be effective, particularly in youth who are often targeted for disparate discipline, so youth of color. There's some other great work that capitalizes on young people who've got high social status. And so if you take the sort of influencers in middle school and you have them lead changes around fostering a more positive school climate, that also seems to be beneficial. So peer relationships are really critical during adolescence, and we can capitalize on those and leverage them to create sort of school-wide change. And then finally, facilitating youth's sense of agency and decision-making to resist negative influences. One of the most successful kind of anti-smoking campaigns was the Truth campaign, because it really sort of sent the message to kids that they had agency in saying no to big tobacco. It wasn't just focusing on here's what will happen if you pick up a cigarette. So those sorts of interventions capitalize on developmental needs. Okay. So I am near the end, and I said I would come back to sleep because I think it's an area where there's opportunity to kind of think about policy and practice. Findings from sleep loss studies of adolescents prompted the American Academy of Pediatrics to recommend that secondary schools start at 8:30 or later. However, less than 20% of middle schools currently do so. So it's a policy channel that's still open for change. Within families at kind of a micro level, bedtime monitoring can be beneficial. And there's also, there's a ton of debates around the pros and cons of screen time and sort of social media. One of the areas where there isn't debate is that being on a screen right before bedtime can interrupt sleep. So monitoring that is a kind of a small scale way of making change. Some research that recently came out from Adriana Galvan and Andrew Fellini, who are with the Center for the Developing Adolescent here on the West Coast, has found that more consistent sleep seems to be most beneficial for adolescent health. And Adriana's work shows that having a pillow that really is sort of a good pillow for you was really beneficial. So it was this odd finding in one of their studies where they tracked adolescents over a period of time. Those who had the most consistent high-quality sleep also reported that they had a pillow that they really enjoyed. So it sounds very simple, but it seems like, that's something that we might do. Okay, so I want to end on this slide, which is another take-home message from the report, and that's that research has fundamentally changed our understanding of how young people develop, grow, and learn. So that means that society must embrace this new knowledge in order to reimagine systems so that all young people can thrive. Thank you.